There are many ways you can knit a sweater. You can knit one in panels, you can knit a raglan sweater, you can knit from the bottom up in the round, you can knit the sweater to have set-in sleeves, which come in many different shapes, but I'm gonna stop there. It can get pretty overwhelming, even for me, so I'm gonna teach you how to knit a basic sweater, and you can customize it to your liking, whether you want a solid chunky knit sweater, a thin striped sweater, or a sweater with cool designs on it. If you don't already know how to knit, I show the techniques in this tutorial, but I go more in depth in my knitting guide that's linked in the card to the right and in the description box below. Before you can start knitting a sweater, you'll need a couple of tools. The first is yarn. For sweaters, I personally prefer to use a yarn that's a blend of wool and acrylic so that it has natural fibers, but can be also thrown into the washing machine and isn't itchy. For this sweater, I'm using 2 of Vaughn's Hue and Me, which is an acrylic wool blend and is a weight 5 chunky yarn. The next tool you'll need are knitting needles. I recommend you choose your needles according to the label on your yarn. For this sweater, I'm using 9mm needles for the ribbing sections and 10mm needles for the stockinette sections. It's not a requirement to use 2 needle sizes, but the ribbing on the sweater will look bigger than the body of the sweater if you just use the same needle size for the entire project. For my needles, I'm also using a 15-inch cable for the collar and arm sections when working in the round, and a 23-inch cable for working the body panels. The last things you'll need are a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle, measuring tape, and stitch markers. If you're going to make a sweater with larger needles, then I recommend getting these large round stitch markers, since the latch ones can't slide on and off the needles the way you'd need them to when knitting the sweater. To knit a sweater, you're going to have to do some math, but don't worry, thankfully it's incredibly easy. First, you'll need to take some measurements. You'll need the width you desire the sweater to be. This can be your exact shoulder width or way past your shoulders to make it oversized. If you don't know what number you should choose, measure one of your favorite sweaters and take that number down as the shoulder width. You also need the length you desire the sweater to be, so either measure from your shoulders down to where you want the sweater to stop, or again, measure the length of one of your favorite sweaters and write that number down. After you have your measurements, you need to make a gauge swatch. A gauge swatch is a small swatch that's made with the yarn you want to use for your sweater, as well as what stitch you're going to use for the majority of the sweater. This swatch helps you figure out how many stitches you'll need to cast on to start the sweater. For this swatch, I did a cast on of 20 stitches and worked up 8 rows with 8mm needles and weight 5 yarn. What you're going to do is measure the width of the swatch from one end to the other. Write this number down. For my swatch, it ended up being 8.5 inches wide. This means for every 20 stitches I do, I'll have 8.5 inches. You can also measure how many stitches are in 1 inch. For my swatch, this was 2 stitches, so every 2 stitches I have 1 inch. You can write this down too. Now it's time to make the calculations. Here's the formula you'll be using to determine the number of stitches you'll need to cast on to start the sweater. So you'll first plug in your numbers in the appropriate spots, the measurement of the swatch, which for mine was 8.5 inches, the number of stitches in the swatch, which for mine was 20 stitches, the measurement in inches, which is your shoulder width. Mine was 21 inches in width that I preferred. The last number is for the cast on, which is what we're trying to find. Now that all the numbers are in the formula, go ahead and multiply the number of stitches in the swatch by the desired measurement. For me, this was 20 times 21. The sum for me was 420. Now divide that number by the width of the swatch. My swatch was 8.5 inches wide, so I divided 420 by 8.5. My sum is 49.4. I recommend rounding up to an even number, since the cast on amount should be divisible by 2, since we're doing a 1x1 ribbing to start. So my cast on amount is 50 stitches. Now that you have all of your tools and your measurements, it's officially time to start the sweater. To get started with the sweater, first take your smaller needles. Mine is 9mm needles with a 23-inch cable, and your ribbing yarn, and get ready to do a long tail cast on. To find out how much yarn you need to cast on, first take the yarn and wrap it around the needle 10 times. Then pick up the yarn from the 10th wrap, and that shows you that you have 10 stitches within that tail of yarn. To add more stitches, fold the yarn like so, then you'll have 20 stitches. Fold it again, and you'll have 30, and so on. You're going to do this until you reach where your cast on amount is. So since my cast on amount is 50, I folded the yarn until I got to 50, then pulled a bit extra out after. It's better to have extra yarn left over than not having enough. Once you have the amount you need, you're going to push the yarn together, which will form a loop. Then use your fingers to pull the left strand of yarn into the loop. Then pull the right strand down to tighten the knot on the bottom. And now all you have to do is put your needle inside the loop and pull the ends to tighten. And now you're ready to cast on. To do the long tail cast on, all you have to do is take the yarn attached to your ball of yarn and place it in your left hand. The tail yarn that isn't connected to the ball is in your right hand. Wrap the connected yarn clockwise around your thumb. Then take your needle and insert it from the bottom into the same little space as your thumb. With your right hand, take the tail yarn and wrap it around the needle counterclockwise. Then use your thumb to push the loop off your thumb and onto the needle. Once it's on the needle, pull the left strand of yarn until the loop is fitted onto the needle. Don't do it super tight or super loose though. And that is one stitch casted on. So again, wrap the connected yarn clockwise around your thumb, then take your needle and insert it from the bottom into the same little space as your thumb. With your right hand, take the tail yarn and wrap it around the needle counterclockwise. Then use your thumb to push the loop off of your thumb and onto the needle. Once it's on the needle, pull the left strand of yarn until the loop is fitted onto the needle. And now you have 2 stitches casted on. You're going to repeat this action over and over until you have the amount of cast on stitches you need on your needle. Once everything is casted on, it's time to start the ribbing. For this particular sweater, I did a 1x1 rib, which is knitting 1 stitch, then purling 1 stitch, then repeating this back and forth until the end of the row. To do the 1x1 rib stitch, first knit the first stitch. To do a knit stitch, first take your working needle, which is the needle that doesn't have the stitches on it, and insert it into the first stitch from the bottom to the top, making sure the needle makes sort of an X behind the holding needle. The holding needle is the needle that holds the stitches. Then take your yarn connected to the ball of yarn and wrap it counterclockwise around the working needle. Then take the working needle and drag it down and under the stitch. Then use it to drag the stitch off of the holding needle. When the stitch is finally on the working needle, you can pull the yarn to tighten it a bit if it gets loose. Now we need 1 purl stitch. To do a purl stitch, first take your yarn and pull it to the front. When doing purl stitches, the yarn should always be in the front. When doing knit stitches, it should always be in the back. First, insert your working needle into the stitch from top to bottom, making an X in front of the holding needle. Then wrap the yarn around the working needle counterclockwise. Take your working needle and pull it behind the holding needle, then drag the stitch off the holding needle. That's a purl stitch. Return the yarn to the back of the needle since we have to do a knit stitch again. Next, you're going to make another knit stitch in the next stitch since we need to repeat doing 1 knit and 1 purl. So again, insert the working needle into the first stitch from the bottom to the top, making sure the needle makes an X behind the holding needle. Then take your yarn connected to the ball of yarn and wrap it counterclockwise around the working needle. Then take the working needle and drag it down and under the stitch. Then use it to drag the stitch off the holding needle, and that's how you do a knit stitch. Return your yarn to the front of the needle since we have to do a purl stitch next. For the next stitch, you need another purl stitch, so again, insert your working needle into the stitch from top to bottom, then wrap the yarn around the working needle counterclockwise. Take your working needle and pull it behind the holding needle, then drag the stitch off the holding needle, and that's the purl stitch. Return the yarn to the back of the needle since we have to do a knit stitch again. To tell the difference between a knit stitch and a purl stitch in case you mess up or anything, the knit stitches look like V's and the purl stitches have this little bump in the front. For the rest of the ribbing, you're going to repeat working 1 knit stitch and then 1 purl stitch all the way until the end of the row. Your last stitch should end with a purl stitch. Now that all the stitches are on your working needle, what you're going to do is switch the needles to the opposite hand. So now your working needle is now the holding needle and vice versa. This is how you turn your work. You're now going to again repeat working 1 knit stitch and then 1 purl stitch, and then repeating this until the end of the row. I repeated this for a total of 11 rows, but you can make your bottom ribbing as long or short as you'd prefer. Mine was 2 inches or 5 centimeters for reference. Once the ribbing is complete, I went ahead and changed my needles to 10mm needles. If you don't have interchangeable needles, you can easily take a tapestry needle and a long piece of yarn and insert that yarn into the stitches to hold them in place, remove them off the needles and cord, and then insert your larger needles into the stitches before removing the strand of yarn. The only reason why I switched the needles is so the ribbing can look the same size as the stitches on the body of the sweater, since ribbing tends to look larger like how it does on this sweater, where I didn't change the sizing at all on the ribbing and the body. To get started on the body of the sweater, you first have to switch to your second color. To do this, insert your working needle into the first stitch as if you're about to knit, then take your new color and loop it onto the working needle. Then complete a knit stitch. And that's how you attach a new color. It's that simple, and you can use that same technique to add stripes to any part of your sweater. You can pull the yarn ends to make it tighter so that the yarn doesn't fall off. From there, you're going to work a knit stitch into every stitch in the row with your new color. It might be a bit tight when working into the stitches, but that's because you're working with large needles, so just take your time and you'll be fine. At the end of the row, turn your work. On this side of the project, which is the wrong side, you're going to work a purl into every single stitch. At the end of the row, it's going to feel a bit loose since you attached a new color, but just take your time and finish the row as normal. You can pull the yarn a bit to tighten it if it's too loose. Then turn your work. We just did 2 rows of the body of the sweater. Doing 1 row of all knit stitches and then 1 row of all purl stitches creates something called the stockinette stitch. It's the stitch you usually see when looking at a knit sweater. You're going to continue working stockinette stitch, which is again 1 row of knit stitches, and then 1 row of purl stitches, until your panel is 1 to 2 inches away from reaching your ideal length. For me, this was 14.5 inches plus 2 inches for the ribbing. To separate for the shoulders, we have to figure out where we want the neck to be and where we want the decreases to start. Take your panel and hold it up to your chest. When you do this, use your fingers to find out where your neck ends and your shoulders begin, and use that as a way to figure out where you want the neck on the sweater to be. When you find those places, take 2 stitch markers and mark those spaces. After they're marked, make sure they're aligned with where you want the neck to be. The place in between the 2 stitch markers is where the neck is going to be, and the places outside the stitch markers are where the shoulders are going to be. The shoulder sections should be the same amount of stitches, so count the stitches outside of the stitch markers. If they aren't the same number, adjust the stitch markers. For mine, I had 23 stitches on the right shoulder and 16 on the left, so I went ahead and adjusted it to 21 stitches on each shoulder and then 8 stitches in between. You can choose whatever number to make the shoulders, but make sure the amount of stitches for the neck section is going to be enough to go past your neck. Also remember that we're going to decrease for the shoulder section soon, so don't make the neck too big unless that's the style you're going for. Once the stitch markers are where they need to be, knit your first shoulder section until you reach the first stitch marker. The stitch marker marks the beginning of the neck section, which will be casted off. At the stitch marker, push it to the other needle and then knit the first 2 stitches. Take the first stitch and drag it over the second stitch. That's 1 stitch casted off. For the next stitch, knit it normally, Then pull the first stitch over the second. That's a second stitch casted off. You're going to repeat this until your next section is casted off, which for mine is 8 stitches. If you were counting your cast-offs, you probably noticed you have 1 stitch less than your number. That stitch is actually on your working needle, and you have to cast off with the stitch after the next stitch marker. So move that stitch marker off, knit the next stitch, cast off, and now you have your accurate number of next stitches casted off. After that's complete, go ahead and knit the second shoulder, which you already have 1 stitch done for. At the end of the row, turn your work. From here, we're going to do our shoulder decreases. To do this, purl normally until the last 2 stitches. At the last 2 stitches, you're going to work a decrease by purling into both stitches at the same time. So stick your needle into both stitches purlwise, then purl it normally. Now you have 1 less stitch on that shoulder. We'll be working each shoulder individually, so turn your work, and in the first 2 stitches on the right side, you'll work a decrease again. So insert your needle into both stitches knitwise, then knit normally. After, knit the rest of the row normally. At the end of the row, turn your work and repeat working a purl row normally. Then in the last 2 stitches, work a purl decrease. Then turn your work, then work a knit decrease in the last 2 stitches. Then work the row normally. After a total of 4 rows of decreases are complete, you're going to cast off the first shoulder. So knit or purl the first 2 stitches depending on what side of the project you're on. Then pull the first stitch over the second, and that's a cast off. If you're working on a purl row, place your yarn to the back before pulling the first loop over the second, just to get it out the way. Then pull it back to the front to continue casting off. Repeat this for the entire shoulder section. You'll have 1 more stitch remaining, so to get rid of it, just create a cast on by looping the yarn clockwise over your thumb and placing the loop onto your working needle. Then pull the first loop over the second, cut a bit of a tail, then pull up the yarn to create a knot. Then your first shoulder is complete. For the second shoulder, insert your needles into the same side you started your decreases on for the first shoulder. If you started them on a purl row, then insert your needles into the first 2 stitches on the purl side. Take your yarn and loop it onto the working needle. Then purl into both stitches normally. After, work the row normally. Repeat working decreases into the 2 stitches near the neck section for a total of 4 rows. It doesn't have to be 4 rows, you can customize it based on how wide you want the neck section to be, but I usually aim for 4 to 6 rows of decreases. Once the 4 rows of decreases are complete, cast off the second shoulder. Then your first panel is complete. Now repeat all the steps exactly the same to make a second panel. Once the 2 panels are completed, it's time to attach them. Take the 2 panels and place them like shown. Then take the stitch markers and align the casted off shoulders with each other. To attach the shoulders together, first take a tapestry needle and a semi-long piece of yarn that's an inch longer than both sides of one of the shoulders. In the panel closest to you, insert your tapestry needle into the first V-stitch on the right side of the panel. Pull the yarn through, but make sure to leave a tail. Then in the panel away from you, go into the corresponding V-stitch on the right as well. Pull through gently. Then take your needle and go into the next V-stitch on the panel closest to you and pull through. Go through the V-stitch on the other panel and pull through. As you do this, the shoulders will start to seam together. You're going to repeat this until you reach the end of the first shoulder. At the end, just go into any leftover stitch you can to make sure the second shoulder is completely seamed. Then go ahead and repeat the same steps onto the second shoulder, first by going into the first V-stitch and pulling your yarn through, then going into the second panel and doing the same. Take your 9mm needles and your 15-inch small cord and insert the needle into any of the stitches on the neckline. Take your yarn and create a loop with it, then place it on the needle and pull the needle through to create a stitch. Then take your needle and insert it into the next space, and wrap the yarn around the needle counterclockwise before pulling the needle and yarn through. You're going to continue doing this around the entire neckline, making sure you make enough stitches to be divisible by 2. If you need to, you can skip a space and work into the space after, but do note that this will make the collar a bit smaller, so just eyeball it as you go. I ended up with 38 stitches on my needle, which was perfect. This counts as 1 row. After you reach your cast on amount that's divisible by 2, go ahead and make another stitch either in the next empty space or in the same space as the last stitch. After, take your working needle and pull the first stitch onto the working needle. Then cast off that stitch by pulling the second loop over the first on the working needle. Place that stitch back onto the holding needle. This is how you join in the round. Take a stitch marker and place it on the working needle to indicate where the start of the row is. Then work a 1x1 ribbing. So first knit the first stitch, then purl the next stitch, then repeat working 1 knit stitch and then 1 purl stitch. It may be difficult to move the stitches around, but that's only going to happen for the first row. Once you reach the stitch marker, slip it over to the working needle and take a note that you just finished the second row. Then repeat working rows of 1x1 ribbing for as long as you want the collar to be. For mine, I did 4 rows, which was 1.5 inches in length. Once you have the amount of rows you wanted, go ahead and cast off with the tubular cast off method. To do this, first cut off an incredibly long tail. Make sure to overestimate how much yarn to cut off so you can make sure you have enough of it. For the tubular cast off, you first have to set up the cast off and then work in repeating sections. For the setup, first take your tapestry needle and go through the first stitch as if you're purling it. Then pull through. Then pull your needle from the back to the front from in between the first and second stitch. Then insert it into the second stitch as if you're knitting. then pull it through. Now it's set up and now you can do the repeating sections of the cast off. For the repeating sections of the tubular cast off, first insert your tapestry needle into the first knit stitch knitwise, slip it off the holding needle and pull the yarn through. Then insert your tapestry needle purlwise into the second knit stitch and pull your yarn through. Now take a look at your stitches. The first stitch is now a purl stitch, so whenever there's a purl stitch as your first stitch, you're going to insert your tapestry needle purlwise, slip it off, and pull the yarn through. Then pull your yarn through the in-between of the first and second stitch. Then insert your tapestry needle into the next purl stitch knitwise and pull through. Whenever the first stitch is a knit stitch, you're going to insert your tapestry needle knitwise, slip it off, and pull through. Then insert your tapestry needle into the second knit stitch purlwise and pull through. You're going to repeat this around the entire collar until all the stitches are off. For the last 2 stitches, go through the stitches according to what it is. So since I have a knit stitch first, I'm going through it knitwise. Then in the stitch of the already completed section here, I'm going to work through it purlwise. Then in the last purl stitch, work into it purlwise. Then work into the second finished stitch knitwise. Then the collar is complete. You can now try on the sweater and be happy that you're halfway done. To create the arm sections, first try on your sweater and choose any area on the sides that give you enough space for your arms. You can use a stitch marker to mark where that is. Make sure to make the sides as evenly as possible for both sides. I personally counted from the stitch marker I marked all the way across to the other armhole to make sure they were both marked on the same rows. Before you can begin the arm, you have to sew the sides closed until you reach the stitch markers. To do this, take your tapestry needle and a long piece of yarn and first work into the bottom first stitch of one of the panels. Pull your yarn through until you have a tail. Then work into the same exact stitch on the other panel and pull through. In the first panel, you're going to find this bar stitch here that sits in between the V stitches. Go through that with your tapestry needle and find the bar stitch in the next stitch on the other panel. Pull through both. You're going to repeat this going up the ribbing so that they connect. Once the ribbing is complete, you can start going through the body of the sweater by again going through the bar stitch that's in between the V stitches. Continue this pattern until you reach the stitch marker. Once you reach the stitch marker, work into the 2 stitches that it's holding and then cut a tail. Now repeat these same steps for the other side of the sweater. To start the sleeves, first find a stitch on the armhole you want to start the arms in, and insert your 10mm needles there with the 15-inch cable. Take your sleeve color yarn and loop it onto the needle. Take your needle and drag it and the yarn looped around it through the stitch, which creates one cast on stitch. To cast on more, insert the needle into the next stitch you want to work into and wrap the yarn counterclockwise around the needle. Then pull the needle and yarn through again. You're going to repeat this around the armhole, skipping stitches here and there. There wasn't a specific pattern that I chose to skip stitches, but make sure you don't skip too many or the arms will be tight. After reaching the end of the row, I had a total of 41 stitches for the arm. This counts as one row. After, you're going to join the sleeves in the round by taking your working needle and pulling the first stitch onto the working needle. Then cast off that stitch by pulling the second loop over the first on the working needle. place that stitch back onto the holding needle. That's how you join in the round. Take a stitch marker and place it onto the working needle to indicate where the start of the row is, then work stockinette stitch in the round. To do this, all you're going to do is knit into every stitch for the entire row. Once you reach the stitch marker stitch, place it onto the working needle, write down that you just finished the second row, and then again, work another row of only knit stitches. When working in the round for stockinette stitch, you don't have to turn your work and do any purl stitches. You can just knit every row. I worked my arms until they were 14 inches long, which was a total of 45 rows. On row 46, or the row after you reached your arm length preference, you're going to begin working decreases. To do this, knit the first 2 stitches together. After, knit the next 2 stitches together. Then the next stitch, knit normally. You're going to alternate between knitting 2 together knitting 2 together again, and then knitting 1 normally all around until you're close to the end of the row. Near the end, I counted my stitches, which was 23 stitches. Since it'll be uneven if I knit them normally, I just did the last 2 stitches with a decrease, which gave me 24 stitches in total. You should end with an even amount of stitches. For the next row, switch to 9mm needles. Then begin working 5 rows of 1x1 ribbing, starting with 1 knit stitch, then 1 purl stitch, then alternating between the 2 for 5 rows. When the cuff is complete, you're going to work the tubular cast off method again. To do this, you first have to set up the cast off and then work in repeating sections. For the setup, first take your tapestry needle and go through the first stitch as if you're purling it, then pull through. Then pull your needle from the back to the front from in between the first and second stitch. Then insert it into the second stitch as if you're knitting, then pull it through. Now the setup is complete, and now you can do the repeating sections of the cast off. For the repeating sections of the tubular cast off, first insert your tapestry needle into the first knit stitch knitwise, slip it off the holding needle, and pull the yarn through. Then insert your tapestry needle purlwise into the second knit stitch and pull your yarn through. Now take a look at your stitches. The first stitch is now a purl stitch, so whenever there's a purl stitch as your first stitch, you're going to insert your tapestry needle purlwise, slip it off, and pull the yarn through. Then pull your yarn through the in-between of the first and second stitch. Then insert your tapestry needle into the next purl stitch knitwise and pull through. Whenever the first stitch is a knit stitch, you're going to insert your tapestry needle knitwise, slip it off, and pull through. Then insert your tapestry needle into the second knit stitch purlwise and pull through. You're going to repeat this around the entire ribbing until all the stitches are off. For the last 2 stitches, I first went into the first stitch purlwise and pulled through. Then I pulled my yarn through the middle of the stitches, then worked into the stitch of the already completed section here knitwise. Then in the last stitch, I worked into it knitwise, then worked into the second finished stitch purlwise. Then the wrist ribbing is complete. Repeat all of these steps for the second armhole. This is what the completed sweater looks like. You can stop here if you want to, but if you want to put a design onto the sweater, you're first going to have to either find a pixel grid you like online or create your own. If you're going to use an already made graph, make sure it's small enough to fit in the middle of your sweater, depending on the graph. If you're going to do something like stars, for an example, you can make them bigger or smaller depending on how many you're going to add onto it. This is the graph that I chose for the sweater since it's fall time. Before you start the graph, first count how many stitches the graph is vertically and horizontally. Then label how many stitches are in each column of color on the graph vertically, since to do duplicate stitching, the rows are best worked vertically. To figure out where to put the graph on the sweater, first put the sweater on and mark with stitch markers your desired area from where you'd want the graph to start and stop vertically and horizontally. Then once you do that, you can adjust the stitch markers according to the actual graph. The way I adjusted it is by first counting down from the top stitch marker until I reached the stitch that the last stitch marker on the graph would be. For this pumpkin graph, there's 24 stitches vertically and 27 stitches across. This middle stitch lets me know where the middle of the graph is, which I figured out by counting down until I reached the middle. It helped me figure out where the sides of the graph would start and stop by taking that number, which is 27, then dividing it by 2. It's 13.5, so I counted from the middle stitch marker to one side until I got to 13. Then I counted from the side stitch marker over until I reached stitch 27. From there, I used my fingers to see the first starting point by sliding from the bottom and right stitch markers down until my fingers reached each other. This stitch is the right bottom corner, and from there I counted up 7 stitches, which is where we'll start the duplicate stitching since we'll be working it vertically. To start working the design, first take your yarn and your tapestry needle. Then where the right bottom corner stitch marker is, insert your tapestry needle into the bottom of that stitch from the inside the sweater. Pull the yarn through, leaving a tail. Then you're going to put your tapestry needle into the 2 legs of the V-stitch above the stitch you want the design to be on. Pull through. Don't pull too tight, but also don't pull too loose either. My ending result of the sweater has a bunch of visible stitches of the beige due to me having uneven tension, so just take your time so that won't happen. But it's also okay if it does. Once it's pulled through, you can remove the stitch marker. To finish the stitch, work into the same place on the bottom of the stitch and pull the yarn back into the inside of the sweater. That's 1 duplicate stitch. Since I'm working vertically, I'll be working the next stitch here by working the exact same technique. So again, take your tapestry needle and pull it up without pulling too hard. Then in the 2 legs of the stitch above the stitch you want the color to be, work into that stitch. Then work into the same spot where you brought up the yarn first. You're going to continue this pattern vertically until the first row of color is complete. For the second row, I'm going to be working with my orange yarn and working downward. To work duplicate stitch downwards, first insert your tapestry needle into the bottom of the stitch you want to work at and pull the yarn through. Then you're going to work the yarn through the V legs of the stitch above the stitch where you want the color to land. This one already has yarn on it, but that's perfectly fine since you're just working under the stitch. After, insert the yarn into where you brought it up first and pull through. Then just repeat this going downwards. The same technique applies if you're working sideways. Once everything on the sweater is complete, you have to weave in your ends. To weave in your ends on the graph, first take your tapestry needle and tail end and insert it into one of the same color stitches of the graph very gently. You don't want to pull it or it'll mess up the graph in the front. You're going to repeat this for as much as you want to make sure it's extra secure. Then cut the excess yarn. Check the front of the sweater to make sure you haven't pulled the graph too tightly. To weave your ends in on the ribbing sections, insert your yarn and tapestry needle into one of your V stitch legs. Then insert it into every leg like so. Pull your yarn through and repeat this on the other side of the V. You can stop here, but I like to go into the next V section for extra security. Once that's weaved in, you can go ahead and cut the excess yarn off. For seam sections, you can repeat the same steps shown for the ribbing. For any tails you may have on the stockinette sections, first work into any stitch. Then you'll want to insert your yarn into the next stitch but diagonally. Repeat working into the stitches diagonally like so. Then repeat this in the opposite direction. After, cut off the excess yarn and your sweater is complete. You just knitted a whole sweater. How cool is that? Like I said before, my design section of the sweater isn't perfect since I'm still getting the hang of doing duplicate stitching, but as long as you're taking your time and making sure you're not pulling too tightly, your sweater design should come out 10 times better than mine if you're doing the duplicate stitching method. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!